A ton of conversation and debates about the sex industry lead absolutely nowhere. Sometimes you can learn something from a debate, even if no party concedes any ground whatsoever, but more often than that, you're going to be frustrated and angry, or maybe even hurt or scared, as I've been on occasions. Because debates about prostitution can get really, really nasty. So if you haven't had many yet, and you don't quite know what you're getting into, in this video I'll try to prepare you for all the bullshit that you're going to have to put up with if you start speaking out publicly, or even just in your social circle about prostitution. Prepare for accusations of misandry. Surprise, surprise. People, men and women, will be made uncomfortable by you pointing to male Johns as the core problem and as primary perpetrators of violence against prostitute women. It doesn't matter that Johns are a minority amongst men in most countries, or how much evidence of their misogyny and violence you can show. Attacking them is taken by some people to mean that you hate all men. A lot of women will fervently defend punters because facing the truth that some of these scumbags may be their loved one is very painful. This exact same thing happens if you want to address other forms of male violence, so it's not surprising. One way to counteract that is to remind people that men aren't born punters, but they're socialized into it. However, be careful about this argument, since it can be taken by some people to mean that, therefore, they are not really responsible for their actions at all. After all, many people empathize and identify with Johns. In 2018, a ton of people, men and women, still believe that men can't help themselves. They're these sad creatures victimized by their own libido. They're really just thirsting for love and intimacy. Disabled and elderly men are some of the favorite pawns in this line of arguing. Of course, it's bullshit. Punters often have partners, have above average numbers of sex partners, even if single, and can be dissuaded from sex buying by effective law enforcement, meaning that they're not actually enslaved by their supposed primal urges, but choosing to act the way they do. Most of them are also young and able-bodied. Prepare to explain all of this over and over and over again. Prepare for gross men. If you can, of course, avoid these types. If you can't, develop a hard shell. There'll be men in this debate denying many or all issues with the sex trade, no matter the amount of studies you can show. Most upsetting of all are probably those who openly boast about being punters and buying sexual access to women. No, wait. The ones who argue that the prostitute women are victimizing them by utilizing their womanly sexual superpowers, those are the most disgusting type. That type has crawled into my comment section before in several public talks that I've attended, often involving survivors. Were also attended by Johns who came just to mess with the presenters. Be prepared for these types of creeps and don't let them get to you. I recommend you don't even argue with them. They won't change their minds. But feel free to threaten them with the Nordic model because they hate it. And they are so worried about it spreading. You can read it on their online forums. They're pissing themselves. It's the only source of joy from those vile digital congregations. Prepare to be called a white feminist. Doesn't matter if you're of color, you can literally be a sex trade survivor of color and be called a white feminist for supporting prostitution abolition. Basically, anyone who doesn't support the belief that women everywhere and all the time are making conscious, well-thought-through, empowering choices and instead suggests that female socialization, trauma, racism, violence, etc. funnel women into harmful situations is a white feminist. The most extreme form of this I saw on my channel was a woman who argued that all prostitution abolitionists were white feminists and any sex trade survivors of color were being paid off by us or brainwashed through a bizarre form of internalized racism. It's basically the conspiracy theory that prostitution abolitionists want to rob women of color, who make up the majority of the women in the trade, of their income, or at best are too ignorant to understand that women of color depend on prostitution, supposedly, and need it to continue. If you, like me, then start linking to blogs and videos of women of color criticizing prostitution and racism and colonialism, you'll just be accused of tokenization, so it's set up in a way that you can't win. But someone who isn't completely dense listening in on your debate may change their mind. Prepare for accusations of hurting prostitute women. Yeah, I'm not exaggerating. Just by talking on the internet, you don't even have to do any real-life activism to be charged with this. You'll be accused of contributing to prostitute women becoming unemployed, being shunned by society, and even killed. You talking about the lack of agency of prostitute women will be interpreted by quite a number of people on the pro-sex trade side as contributing to actual real-life loss of agency for prostitute women. I've had texts of mine removed from the internet just for saying the term prostitute woman instead of sex worker, because if I argue that prostitution is something that is done to a woman in which she has little to no power, then I am supposedly arguing that women are helpless damsels in distress and encourage predators to view them that way. I kid you not, if you assume that women in sex trade need assistance with healthcare, job training, or leaving prostitution, you're accused by some people of creating a harmful victim narrative which hurts the women you're trying to help. It doesn't matter how many times you say that the support is meant to be unconditional, secular, and entirely optional. And I'm really not kidding when I say that a fair number of people highly invested in this debate even believe that addressing the violence in the sex trade, especially the violence committed by punchers and pimps, creates stigma against the women in the industry. That stigma in turn is said to inspire more violence. Curiously enough, the actual perpetrators of that violence are rarely ever named, because that would ruin the narrative that Johns and pimps are really just friendly altruists. If you think about it, it's all dynamics which we know from other debates. Supposedly feminists are responsible for women becoming uppity and needing to be put in their place through violence by their partners. It's pretty much the same deal here. Talk about male violence and watch how fast someone accuses you of normalizing and contributing to that very same violence. Prepare for people probing your private life about either signs of prudery or trauma. No, really, prepare for complete strangers, men and women, to inquire about the details of your sex life. If you're inexperienced, celibate, anti-porn, or even just labeled vanilla, you may be accused of not understanding the sexual urges of other people and being a prude. If you've ever experienced sexual violence, or someone close to you has, and your opponent knows, you'll be accused of a personal vendetta and a clouded view on the sex trade. If you're a lesbian, then of course you're accused of not understanding male sexuality or being a special kind of misandrist. I've been asked invasive, inappropriate questions like, "Are you still a virgin?" assuming that you can only have an opinion on the sex trade if you've had sex. By that logic, you wouldn't be allowed an opinion on slavery unless you ever worked a full-time job. Yeah, makes no sense. I've been asked if I masturbate or not, because as my opponent argued, surely if I knew how half-baked masturbation was, I'd understand that it's not an adequate replacement during lifespans without willing sex partners. All of these weren't asked by strangers on the internet. They were asked by people my age standing right in front of me. If you have no experience in the sex trade, that by itself may be cause for someone to dismiss everything you say. Curiously enough, they don't necessarily have to have any experience either, but since they have the correct opinion, they don't need to. If you do have experience in the sex trade, no matter how educated on the subject you are, no matter how many studies you reference or any such efforts, if you oppose prostitution, you'll be told that it's your personal, individual experience, and you can't go projecting that onto others in the trade. They may concede that prostitution was violence for you, but if you're open about your wounds and your trauma, that too will be used to dismiss your views. Then, in other cases, you may be told that you getting hurt was your own fault, that you didn't take proper precaution, or simply weren't tough enough for the trade. Or, of course, that you're pretending and making it all up, which is just... I'm sorry for all the survivors who had to go through that. You have my utmost respect for marching on despite all that crap. So, summing up, your personal experience with sex or sexual violence or lack thereof are supposed to be on the table and are open for probing, and for using to justify a rejection of your entire political analysis. Meanwhile, your opponent may get offended at you for inquiring if they have personal reasons for defending prostitution, and they don't have to tell you anything about themselves. Prepare for a big fat double standard with those kind of people. Prepare for being dismissed for being emotional. Especially if you're a woman, you're expected to talk about feminist issues calmly and nicely. You're not supposed to get angry or swear or cry, and if you do, be ready for people to dismiss everything you say just because of that. It doesn't matter that most people allow their male political speakers and leaders to shout and get emotional all the time. If you're female, that's a no-go. Now, I'm not actually saying that you should give into that pressure and never ever get emotional. Passion for women's rights can also inspire other women and girls, and pretending like everything is okay when you're talking about women being raped and murdered is weird and unnatural. Just be prepared that there'll be people, men and women, rolling their eyes and shaking their heads. but do not let them shut you up. Some well-meaning people may approach you about your politics and ask if you're not maybe overburdening yourself with this topic, as it could potentially be wearing you down emotionally. Would anyone go up to a male political activist and ask him if he's maybe too fragile to deal with topics around severe violence and human rights violations? I doubt it. And it's not that there's never any reason for legitimate concern over politics hurting you emotionally. The topic of prostitution and the rape and murder of women can weigh too heavy on your shoulders. But what I find hurts the most is the kind of dismissal I've been talking about in this video. The denial of the reality of women's pain hurts the most. When you've woken up to a topic like prostitution, there's basically no going back to pretending and buying the happy sex work line. So please take all the breaks and timeouts that you need from the topic. You don't owe anyone activism. Your needs, emotionally, physically, come first. But if you can't ever fully distance yourself, because you recognize porn culture everywhere. It's in your personal relationships with men, and there's strip clubs and brothels all over your city. The best coping mechanism is to say, I'm not going to take this. I'm going to find my fellow women who've been fighting this fight for years and decades, and we're going to change this. In conclusion, speaking about prostitution publicly requires you to be emotionally strong, because there's always people watching to see whether you slip up, and they can beat you down for it. But nevertheless, it's worthwhile. If there's just one woman or girl whom you can send some hope to, support, get out, or stop from getting into prostitution. So that's what annoys the heck out of me and wears me down when debating prostitution. What are some warnings and advice that you have for feminists or allies new to the debate? Let me know in the comment section.